Morning, everyone. Thanks so much for joining us for our Tuesday talk. We're going to give it a few more minutes to give people time to hop on. So if you could just hang in there for a couple minutes, we'll be with you in just a second. For those of you just hopping on, we're just going to give it a few more minutes and then we will get started. Good morning, everyone. Thanks so much for joining us. We're going to get started here in just a few minutes. Just wanted to give you a quick overview of how this is going to work, and then I'm going to turn it over to Chuck to do a quick intro of Gary Lewis. For those of you who have been on here before, you know exactly what to do. If you have any questions, go to the right-hand side of the screen and the question area and just enter the questions. And at the end of the presentation, we will address them and get them taken care of. Other than that, I think we're good to go. I'm going to turn it over to Chuck, and then we'll get started.
Good morning. Thank you, Melissa. Just a couple of years ago, who would have thought the word supply chain disruptions would have meant something? That's something we typically think of in the third world, but it's been our life for the last couple of years, as you all know very well. This morning's guest is Gary Lewis. Gary is the president of Lewis Reliability Resources. a service integration and knowledge transfer company headquartered in Mooresville, North Carolina. Gary's most recognized as a subject matter expert in the area of heat treatment. He's an industrial engineering graduate of Georgia Tech. Gary began his career at Ingersoll Rand and later helped lead the team at Miller Electric. Gary's most proud of his 3 grown children and soon to be 6 grandchildren. And lots of people over many years have confused Gary with Cal Ripken. I'll leave that up to you if you think he looks like Cal Ripken. But Gary, really appreciate you joining us today and talking about this issue that's on a lot of our members' minds.
Chuck, it's my honor. I'm going to start like this. They probably won't see the resemblance, but anyway, I'm going to hide the glare, put my glasses on so I can read the screen. Everything okay on your end, Melissa?
Yep, all good.
Oh, fantastic. Well, listen, I want to thank you and Chuck an awful lot for inviting me to join your group. This Tuesday Talk idea, I really like it, and I'm going to suggest that others that I interact with, consider hosting something like this too. I want to thank the members that have taken time out of their morning to join us as well. This is a topic, like Chuck said, that's very current, very dynamic, things changing all the time. I'm going to give you a little background on this in just a second, and you'll see some references to welding in some of the titles, because the original presentation that I gave was actually back in December of this year. I was invited to host a half-day workshop on the topic to the American Welding Society. And out of that presentation came some new relationships that have been really not only beneficial to me, but certainly the clients, the contractors and owners that I deal with a lot. And I wanted to share with you, the objective of this presentation is really to provide some current insight to the supply chain crisis, not from me as any kind of supply chain expert, although I interact with lots of supply chain related, issues and topics in the day-to-day business, but to provide some background stuff from some industry experts. The panelists that were on this half-day workshop, one of them, Jeff Houts, was running his own consulting business. He was a former director of supply chain for Fluor, and now he's recently joined the Wood Group. So that's why I don't reference that really in this opening slide. A guy named John Hark. If you have any logistics issues out there, he's a PhD in logistics from Texas A&M and has personally helped material transport to some of my clients over the last 3.5 months that I've known him, exporting things globally, coming up with alternative sourcing solutions and things really great. Bill Newell is an unbelievable welding resource, welding engineer from Ohio State, also runs a company that provides exotic and specialty welding materials. And then Mike Minville has run a major fab shop for a contractor down in Louisiana for a number of years. He and Jeff have partnered. And I just wanted to put that slide up there to offer some context and some quick background. We also took this presentation really quickly into the NCPWB national meeting in, I think it was May this year, and built on some of the data there. And that's how I got to meet Chuck, and he invited me to come on and be part of this program. So I've condensed a lot of the material. A lot of the material is not mine, so I'll be reading some of the slides and things because it's not my field of expertise, but I want you to know that in my business, I'm really a service and subject matter integrator for companies. For the last 5 years, I was invited into a consortium of companies that were somewhat interrelated in field construction, in welding and NDE, inspection services, fabrication, heat treatment, material science, and material lab in Chattanooga. And from that, it's opened a lot of really interesting doors, and it couldn't have been more timely now that all the disruptions have occurred in the supply chain. People in many cases don't know where to turn for help. So, whether it's welding related services, machining, electrical pipe fitting, field inspection, heat treatment I mentioned, all the way down to some divine intervention. I'm pretty close friends with several clergy members, some retired military guys, and some politicians around the country. So if I can ever be of help to you, feel free to reach out. I'm usually only 1 or 2 people removed from a great resource. So if you get yourself in a pickle with any of this stuff, just let me know. Okay, so on with the presentation. And by the way, I will give a copy of this presentation to Melissa and Chuck in a PDF form if you need contact information for the future. So that's enough of that. So again, back in May, we gave a presentation to the NCPWB, and I wanted to break down, the term supply chain is thrown around pretty freely these days, but there are so many different components of it that it's really important to take a look at different aspects of supply chain and how they impact you and your day-to-day and your business, both business and personal life, really. First and foremost, over the last 2 years, the pandemic had a major influence on the way that business was conducted around the world. Lots of uncertainty, a lot of new thought processes that came into place, and then certainly the loss of resources that we've taken for granted and grown accustomed to. Out of that, a lot of material shortage. We become dependent on raw materials and things from other part of the world that are making things very difficult for us. The labor landscape has certainly changed an awful lot. The government got involved during the pandemic, as you know, and subsidized a lot of things that caused people to change their outlook on how they viewed work and lifestyles and things like that. Inflation, cost of living impacted, logistics. I'm going to spend probably 25% of this presentation on logistic things that I had no idea were taking place and going on, and it helped put some things in perspective to me and gave me a little bit different outlook on how to solve some of the problems that my customers are faced with. Global politics, cost and risk. I think one thing, if I don't mention it later in the program, is the reference to force majeure. I mean, I've known about that term contractually for a long time, but I've never seen it implemented. And now people are using the pandemic and the global supply chain crisis to pull out of contracts without incurring damages and things, kind of act of nature or act of God, that type of thing. So it's also forced people to change their business processes in how they conduct their business in the field, both technologically and in terms of actually day-to-day activities. So anyway, real broad topic, and we're going to touch on a few things. I'm going to try to provide a little bit of analytical data and then maybe some interesting solutions that some people are using to overcome some of the problems they're faced with. Since we did the NCPWB meeting, I also attended another construction conference that was down in Florida, actually, and the keynote speaker was a guy out of Baltimore. You guys might be familiar with him. He's really well known nationally. He's an economist named Anirban Basu. So a couple of these slides here, you can see I just took pictures with my camera. I didn't have the luxury of having his presentation handy, but I thought it would be really interesting additional insight to add to this little discussion today. So anyway, Anirban, he was pretty optimistic about things in light of some of the really terrible metrics that are flowing in. So that was somewhat encouraging. But he said this will continue to be a year of growth. We're not back to pre-pandemic levels in almost any aspect of our business yet. They talk about low unemployment and things like that. Well, we're not close to the employment levels that we were at, 2.5 years ago. So different ways of looking at these metrics, but the economy, he suggests, will remain unbalanced with supply chains struggling to keep up with demand. Lots of influences geopolitically in Ukraine and Russia, the Omicron virus, China, Europe, all hampering the recovery that we would traditionally see, along with rising wages amidst the great resignation. And he used that terminology to represent the fact that so many people have left the workforce and changed their view on working that it's translated into higher than average economy-wide inflation since 2022. And then he closed by saying, yes, I'm an economist and I'm forecasting that interest rates will increase. So that's almost a no-brainer. So a few data points here. These visuals are always helpful for me. This goes back to 2000 all the way up to April of 2022. So you can see what's happening to the cost of goods in the field. A lot of times economists or people on TV won't necessarily use a number that's all inclusive of food and energy. But that number is basically 8.5% and rising today. So it's overcoming a lot of the traditional and conventional cost of living increases that we see at work. The construction material price index, just going down the list here. I mean, the energy costs, whether it's natural gas or electricity, skyrocketing, as you know, certainly have an impact on cost of goods, transport of goods, lots of different aspects of what we're paying for in the economy today. So you can kind of read that for yourself. It's not good news, and there's really no end in sight at this point. So license to be paid. If you look at this chart from about the middle of the first part of 2021, the chart started increasing fairly substantially, and that was trying to encourage people back into the workforce. That's Anabon, by the way, down in the right-hand bottom portion of the screen. And then license to borrow. Just yesterday in the news, they actually talked about mortgage rates now bumping up from 5.25 to 6.0. We're expected to see the Fed raise those interest rates again more substantially than suspected. And I know you guys have probably been watching the stock market the last 3 or 4 days. It's not been pretty. So lots of things that are influencing what we're doing today and projecting for the near-term foreseeable future. So that's pretty much it on economics. And by the way, I apologize for the mint in my mouth. I had COVID about 3 weeks ago, and now I'm dealing with kind of a raspy voice as an outcome and trying to avoid the cough. Okay, so let's get into a little bit of the logistics side of the supply chain. Kind of interesting statistics. These were presented by John Hart, the PhD guy that I mentioned to you before. Currently, there's 44 million people in logistics worldwide, but there's over about 1.5 million openings, unfilled openings. So that certainly hampers the ability to move product domestically and around the world. 10,000 people in the US turn 65 every day, according to Pew Research. There's 6 jobs for every qualified candidate. That's expected to get worse by 2030, 9-to-1. 29% of truckers are 55 or older. There's an 80,000 driver deficit in the country today. That's projected to go to 160,000. And then one point that he made that I'll bring up again a little bit later in the presentation is that 32% of our companies don't have supply chain talent, whether it's logistics, whether it's some really sophisticated purchasing, supply chain, supplier leadership within their company. So you end up becoming dependent on other resources outside of your company, and sometimes hard to figure out where to turn to get those resources. Logistics, again, at the height of the pandemic, there were 100 vessels off the port of LA. Now, thankfully, that number's come down a little bit to about 40 ships. It takes them about 2 to 3 days to offload. The container prices impacting the cost of the materials that you're buying out there for imported goods went from about $1,500 a container back in 2020 to a peak of $20,000 per container in 2021. That's come down a little bit to the first of this year, but projected to go back up. And certainly the cargo lines are flush with a lot of cash, but you're going to see in a minute, they're also hit with a lot of bureaucratic and social influence these days that are costing that profit margin to decline pretty significantly. Do a price check here real quick. So don't be fooled by the fact that the ships look like they're getting more under control on the West Coast. The lockdowns are ending in China, according to Jordan Allagher from Goldman Sachs. DHL is also warning that global supply chains won't recover to pre-COVID levels even through 2023. One thing I found really interesting in John's presentation was the size of these cargo containers. Just in the last 10 years, they've almost doubled in size. Cargo ships carried back in 2009, 7.8 billion tons of goods. Now they're up to 11 billion, actually almost doubling the capability of the transport. We're so much more dependent on ocean freight than in the past. Supply chain disruption poses the greatest risk to global economic recovery. The war in Ukraine, I thought, was kind of interesting because, as you know, a lot of the war is taking place in their coastal regions over there and the shipping channels and shipping lanes, and that's starting to have an impact on us over here. Raw materials, farm products, things like that. There are ongoing cyber attacks, just lots of challenges domestically, or excuse me, internationally. One of the things I also thought was kind of interesting, the time it takes a ship to get from China here to the US. Back in 2019, it was about 40 to 45 days in transit. That number's doubled now. The shipping lanes are full and managed. And if you've ever taken the time to take a look at one of the satellite images of the shipping lanes, it's really interesting. Google search that if you haven't done that before. So oceanborne transport is something else. You guys are probably a little bit familiar with accidents at sea that are happening more frequently and stuff now. There was a ship I remember that ran aground in Baltimore not too long ago, and they imposed a terminology called a GA, the general average, where the stakeholders, if you had something in a container on that ship, it was part of your obligation to either offset that cost, not just the shipping line's responsibility. But some really crazy accidents around the world, containers lost overseas, accidents like this one that took place, the ship that went sideways in the Panama Canal. So lots of disruptions logistically that still have impact on us today. Now, one of the aspects of the shipping industry that I thought was kind of interesting was the implementation of these new ESG guidelines and requirements that are being imposed on the shippers. Going to transition to renewable fuel requirements, things like that, health and safety issues, social norms that are being imposed on how they hire and manage people, and new global governance. So shipping lines are basically going green. They're starting to count carbon credits. All those things have an impact on cost of goods and moving materials around the world. So that's pretty much it for the shipping logistics. But I thought a lot of that information was interesting. Specifically to do with Bill Newell's presentation in the welding supply chain, some interesting things that have happened there. I don't know how many of you in construction are dependent on welding. But there's some different aspects of it, both materials and processes and the labor resources that may or may not be available to you like they were 2 years ago. But even before the industry experienced downturns and supply interruptions from COVID, there were signs that many previously available commodity and specialty weld metals were beginning to be in short supply. In many cases, slow-moving or commercially insignificant items were discontinued off the shelves because the cost to carry those items was tough. Minimum order quantities were improved, and that created problems when you had specifications you had to conform to. You couldn't get the brand of product necessarily that was written into the procedure qualification, and you had to come up with alternative sources of supply. So in that case, it's really imperative that you have relationships with people that understand how to overcome those obstacles. Nickel-based products that really come from other parts of the world. Bill was providing quotes that were only good for 24 hours, and I think that's still the case today because of the unpredictable rate of increase of and availability of those products. He started to use air freight. In fact, he's one of the guys that used John Hark, the logistics expert, to move some materials to this part of the world rather than wait on the ship to bring the product. It was cheaper and more reliable for him to subcontract and a 6-ton air freight delivery on some P91 material for a power plant construction that he was doing. A lot of consolidation of the weld metal suppliers. All of these companies used to be independents. Now they've all kind of rolled up under 3 main suppliers around the world, Bohler, ESAB, and Lincoln. Commercially significant concerns, inventories are not created or replenished without orders these days. So again, minimum order quantities apply. Consider the lead times. What used to be 3 to 4 weeks to get on the shelf now are 6, 8, 10, 12, sometimes 6 months or more. So it's having a major impact on projects and what we can execute. So it has to do in the bidding phase as well as the execution. So, the cost to air freight 6 tons of goods was justified when the owner considered the cost of downtime. So, you get sophisticated a little bit in the way that you justify these added logistical and supply chain costs. And there are people out there that are available to help you through that if you haven't had to go through that exercise yourself. the modern supply chain, our GDP is really coming from services these days, not so much manufacturing, although we're trying to onshore more manufacturing back in the US and some of the raw materials, but that's certainly a long, painstaking process to do that. Most orders are driven by low cost. So finding, I don't want to say cheap in the sense that there's no quality involved, but cheap sources of supply is absolutely imperative to your business. So you need to gain insight into your supply chain, alternative sources of supply. A lot of times we've grown comfortable with suppliers that we may have worked with for years, and that's certainly understandable and honorable. But these times are calling for change, basically, and not to say that your existing suppliers aren't a significant part of your long-term strategy, but we need to take better assessment of alternative resources that might be able to help us out down the road. And Jeff pointed this out in his presentation. Again, he's the one that really wrote this, Jeff Houts, the former director of supply chain, that emphasized relationships are more important than ever. And being kind of a business development, sales, networking guy myself, that's usually understated. People typically underappreciate the business development, the sales people, the sourcing people within their organizations. And that's certainly changing now, because those relationships are absolutely critical to the success of projects and running your companies these days. He also noted that vendors have become more willing to share in the problem solving. I should say the owners have been more willing to allow the vendors to have more of a say in the way that projects are planned and executed. So partnerships are becoming more and more the norm than an exception. Welder training, part of this was directed at NCPWB because it was driven around the pipe welding industry and the UA. But they are job specific training people in the field, maybe accelerating the ability to get welders to the job site without having to go through maybe a long 2 or 4 year training program, maybe train people on activity specific or application specific welding techniques. I know that's the case here in North Carolina with the prevalence of the life sciences work, the biotech, the pharmaceutical stuff. Kids that are coming out right now are focusing heavily on automated orbital welding techniques, and those are taught on the side and accelerated so they can get these plants and projects off the ground. Jeff and Mike did a little role play on how they work together in a fabrication environment. It was really helpful and nice, but they really talked about managing scope and activity. Some of these projects can get much more involved than simply putting a bunch of pipe spools together, major modules and things. And it was actually critical that they implemented advancements in digitalization and new work processes. Let's see, I'm just going to jump through a couple of slides here. These are pretty obvious, but back to collaboration, he emphasized it heavily. Transformation into more digitalization, not only for internal work processes where you work, but also in terms of partnership with the owners and suppliers and integrating those that digital information into your overall supply chain solutions. And it's becoming almost a prerequisite these days for major projects. So if you're not on board in that realm, you need to probably step it up. Even things as simple as inventory control on a project site can get very confusing, but the digitalization has certainly helped save people time and money in the field. All right, so kind of almost in closing, we're getting up near the end of the program here, is that there's been a lot of effort put into contingency planning and risk reward analytics. Remember, 32% of the companies don't have supply chain talent. So traditional risk management approaches typically fail because of the complexity of the modern supply chain. So it's really hard to get your arms around this stuff. And I'm just going to reemphasize the fact that you can't have enough resources out there to draw on. And sometimes it'll take one phone call to get to where you want to go. But feel free to reach out. Again, it's a broad topic. Lots of folks available and willing to help, and trying to get everybody through this. We're kind of all in this together. So I always like what Albert Einstein said, strive not to necessarily be a success, but be a value. And that's what we're here to serve folks like you and help you be successful in your businesses. So in closing, it is Flag Day today. So happy Flag Day to everybody. And that's pretty much the end of my planned presentation. I hope that worked out okay, Chuck.
Yeah, excellent, Gary. Thank you very much. Interesting. It's I think I'll just speak for myself. Most of us think of the pandemic. That's why we're going through this. But I think you made your interesting thesis that this really may be beyond the pandemic. It's the perfect storm. You outline, a lot of consolidation in the industry that's happened over the last few years, an aging transportation workforce, much larger ships, the movement towards onshoring, which obviously began before the pandemic, and government paying people not to work. So obviously the top line, the headline issue is the pandemic, but these all issues may have happened irrespective of the pandemic. Maybe not government paying people not to work, but so it does seem to be the perfect storm. And we think of Shanghai and we think of the pandemic, but these issues I think you outlined are interesting. I do have one question, and that's, this I think really because of the aging transportation workforce, this idea of self-driving trucks. I mean, that was the thing before the pandemic and the industry. Not to put you on the spot, but any idea where that is in the life cycle? Is that something this is expediting? Is that you hear about Google and Amazon and these companies that have any thoughts on that? What you're hearing is it going to the average workforce is 10,000 retirees a day. What do you, if anything, are you hearing about that?
Well, it's going to be a challenge and a problem, I guess is what I'm hearing. And I just saw in the news last night, actually, they were showing the drones that are being accelerated through Amazon for delivering packages and things like that. Certainly the fuel costs are just killing, especially the independent truck drivers, right? So you combine that, it's a business decision you got to make as a driver if it's something you want to tolerate and do. So it's helping accelerate the loss of drivers. I mean, it's really becoming a challenge. I'm not sure that I really understood the question other than that to accentuate that's creating lots of problems, and we're having to come up with creative alternatives to get products, from point A to point B, and not to mention even the political pressures. You saw the caravans of drivers that were taken out of the daily working operations to make a political point. So lots of different things, driving people to do things.
Yeah. Any questions out there on the board? Any questions for Gary?
Mm-hmm.
Give it about 10 seconds here, Gary.
Yeah, no worries. Yeah. This stuff has to marinate sometimes. So, if you think about something after the fact, that's fine. No problem. Questions or otherwise. And
what's the best, you put it at the beginning, what's the best, your contact information there? There's your email, your phone number, Gary. If anybody has any follow-up questions, would like to, kind of interact with you directly, 704-905-5957. You see Gary's email address there. Yeah, it looks like our community doesn't have any questions for you. So we really appreciate it. It's an ongoing issue, and this one thing that forgive me if you covered or didn't cover it, but this negotiations with the longshoremen is out there. There's a July 1st deadline with a major collective bargaining agreement, and I guess that's maybe one of the reasons why the president was out at Long Beach last week to try to cajole the two parties to come to terms to an agreement. But as of today, as of this morning, there was no agreement between the longshoremen and their counterparts. So you know, this, although I think you did a good job kind of pointing out where, you know, the trend more recently, you know, March, April, May seems to be improving. You know, God help us if they can't come to a conclusion by July 1st with this major negotiations.
Yeah, that's right. That's a really good point.
So I appreciate it, Gary. We really appreciate your joining us today, and been a real resource to our MCA community. Looking forward to staying in contact with you.
No, it's been my honor. I really appreciate it. Doors always open here in Charlotte. If anybody's ever passing through and wants to have a cup of coffee, I'm here for that, but travel quite a bit too. So anyway, really been an honor and a pleasure meeting both Chuck and Melissa, and thanks to all the members for joining today.
Thank you so much, Gary, and thank you everyone for joining.
Thank you, Gary.
Thank you all.